The docking station floated in the dark like a giant metal spider, its long arms reaching out in every direction, holding ships of every size and shape against its body. Some ships were small and battered. Some were enormous and smooth. But one ship near the far end of the station was different from all the others. It was long and dark, with scales carved into its outer hull in deep patterns that looked almost alive in the low light. The Drakari royal vessel sat in its docking clamp like something ancient and powerful that had decided to rest for a while. Calvin Briggs stood at the edge of the loading bridge and looked at it. He was not a tall man. He was not an impressive man. He had short brown hair that never sat flat no matter what he did to it, a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble because he kept forgetting to shave, and hands that were always a little stained no matter how long he scrubbed them. He wore a gray work jacket with a small patch on the left shoulder that read Briggs Maintenance and Repair, which was the name of the one-man company he had been running for 11 years from a rented workshop on Station 4. He scratched the back of his neck and looked at the ship again. The job offer had come through a commercial relay 3 weeks ago. A Drakari fleet coordinator had contacted his work account with a short message. Their royal vessel had suffered a compression failure in its primary drive chamber during a political transit. They were docked and waiting. They needed a certified human engineer because their own mechanics were unavailable due to a quarantine issue on the home fleet. The pay offered was more than Calvin made in 4 months. He said yes before he finished reading the full message. He picked up his kit bag and walked across the bridge. 2 Drakari attendants were waiting for him at the entrance. They were tall, easily a full head above Calvin, with long necks, narrow, angular faces, and scales that ran in tight rows from their foreheads down to their collarbones. Their eyes were amber and vertical pupilled, and they watched him walk toward them the way a person watches a strange dog approaching, curious, but not relaxed. Calvin raised a hand in a simple greeting. Neither of them moved. He lowered his hand and introduced himself. He said his name was Calvin Briggs and that he was there for the engine work. One of the attendants spoke into a small device clipped near its throat. A translated voice came out of a speaker on the wall beside the door. It said that he was expected and that he would be escorted to the engine bay. It also said that he was not to move through the ship without his escort. He was not to touch anything that was not related to the repair. He was not to enter any forward chambers for any reason. Calvin nodded and said that was fine. He just wanted to fix the engine and get home. The inside of the ship was unlike anything he had worked on before. The corridors were wide and low-lit, with warm amber panels set into the walls that gave everything a deep orange glow. The walls themselves had the same scale pattern as the outside, but here they were smoother, almost like polished stone. The air was warm and carried a faint smell like dry rock and something else underneath it that Calvin could not name, but that felt old, the way certain libraries smell old. The engine bay was at the rear of the ship, behind 3 sets of heavy sliding doors. When they finally reached it, Calvin set his kit bag down and looked at the compression chamber. He let out a long, slow breath through his nose. It was bad. The compression coil had not just failed, it had failed inward, which meant the pressure had folded back into the secondary channel and burned out 3 connected relay nodes. It was the kind of damage that happened when a system was pushed past its recommended limit during a long transit and nobody caught the warning signs in time. It was fixable, but it was going to take several days of careful work. He told the attendant standing near the door what he found and what he would need. The attendant relayed the information. Supplies would be brought. Calvin rolled up his sleeves and got started. He worked quietly and steadily through the first part of the day. The 2 attendants took turns watching him. After a few hours, one of them seemed to relax slightly and pulled out a small device to read something. Calvin did not mind. He was used to working alone. He liked it, actually. The work had a rhythm to it, diagnosing and then solving, and he could lose himself in that rhythm for hours without noticing time passing. What he did not know, as he worked in the warm, amber light of the engine bay, was what was happening at the front of the ship. Deep inside the forward chambers, behind 3 more sets of heavy doors, in a room that was larger and quieter than the rest of the ship, Lady Sarath lay on a long, stone-colored platform surrounded by soft light and silence. She was the queen of the third Drakari royal line. She was also dying. Her scales, which should have been the deep red gold of polished copper, had gone pale and gray at the edges. Her breathing was slow and uneven. Two royal healers sat near her, monitoring instruments that told them what they already knew. The treatments they had tried had not worked. The ones they had not tried were either unavailable or untested. Outside the chamber, her son Varak stood in the corridor with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on nothing. Her daughter Lyra sat on a low bench nearby with a data reader in her hands that she had not looked at in over an hour. Neither of them spoke. In the engine bay, Calvin tightened a bolt, checked his work, and reached for the next tool. He had no idea what was waiting for him deeper in the ship. Cal had been working in the engine bay for most of the day when he realized he needed a specific coupling tool from the secondary supply cart. The attendant who had been watching him had stepped out a few minutes earlier to bring him a container of water and had not yet returned. Calvin looked around the bay, did not see the tool, and checked his kit bag twice. It was not there either. He remembered seeing a maintenance alcove marked on the basic ship diagram the fleet coordinator had sent him before the job. It was supposed to be one corridor to the left of the engine bay, close enough that he figured he could find it quickly and be back before anyone noticed. He picked up the diagram on his small handheld screen, stepped out of the engine bay, and turned left. The corridor looked exactly like the one in the diagram. Warm, amber light. Smooth, scaled walls. Quiet. He walked along it slowly, checking the screen and then looking up at the walls for any alcove marking. He found one, tried the panel, and discovered it was a storage unit for ceremonial items wrapped in dark cloth. Not what he needed. He moved further along, looking for the next one. What he did not notice was that the corridor curved slightly to the right, and that the curve was not on his diagram. The diagram was an older layout of the ship, and the forward section had been reconfigured during a renovation 2 years earlier. The alcove he was looking for no longer existed in that location. It had been moved. In its place, set into the wall so smoothly that it barely looked like a door at all, was a panel that led to a short connecting passage. Calvin found the panel, assumed it was the alcove, and pressed it open. The passage beyond was short, maybe 4 steps long, and ended at another door that was only partially sealed. A thin line of warm light came through the gap. Calvin pushed it gently, expecting to find a supply room. The door swung open. He stepped through and stopped completely. The room was large and quiet and filled with a low, golden light that came from panels set into the ceiling. The walls were carved with deep patterns that looked like wings folded against stone. The air was warmer here than in the rest of the ship and carried that dry, old smell much stronger than before. And in the center of the room, on a long platform of pale gray stone, lay a Drakari woman whose scales had gone almost colorless at the edges. Around her stood 6 Drakari, 2 in healer robes, 2 in formal court dress, and 2 in the dark scaled armor of royal guards. And standing slightly apart from all of them, tall and rigid with his ceremonial blade already at his side, was a young Drakari male, whose copper scales were bright and whose amber eyes had locked onto Calvin the moment the door opened. Nobody moved for 1 full second. Then everything happened at once. The 2 guards stepped forward. The healers pulled back toward the platform. The young male, who was Prince Varak, drew his blade in one smooth motion and took a step toward Calvin. Calvin threw both hands up immediately, his small handheld screen in one and nothing in the other, and said very loudly that he was sorry, that he had the wrong room, that he was just looking for a supply alcove and had taken a wrong turn, and that he was going to leave right now. He began backing up. His left boot caught the edge of a low ceremonial step that ran along the base of the platform, a step he had not seen because he had been watching Varak and the blade. His ankle twisted. He dropped the handheld screen. He reached out with his right hand to grab something, anything, to stop himself from going down. His hand landed on the neck of Lady Sarath. His bare palm, warm from a full day of engine work and still faintly rough with grease that had not washed out fully, pressed flat against the pale gray scales of the dying queen's neck for 3 full seconds before he caught his balance and pulled away. He straightened up and started apologizing again immediately. Then he noticed that nobody was moving. Varak had stopped mid-step. The blade was still in his hand, but he was not advancing. The 2 healers were staring at Sarath with expressions that Calvin could not fully read, but that looked something like shock mixed with something else he had no word for. The princess, standing near the far wall, a younger female with darker scales and quick observant eyes, had moved 2 steps closer to the platform without seeming to realize she had done it. Calvin looked at the queen. Her breathing had changed. It was still slow, but it was no longer uneven. The slight tension that had been visible in her jaw and neck had gone soft, and across the pale gray edges of her neck scales, starting from exactly where Calvin's hand had been, a faint pulse of color moved outward like a wave, a thin line of copper gold that faded after a moment, but was unmistakably there. Calvin stared at it. Then he looked at his hand. Then he looked at the room full of Drakari staring at him. He said very quietly that he was really very sorry about the wrong door and that he was going to go back to the engine bay now if that was acceptable to everyone. Varak moved first. He crossed the room in 4 long strides and took Calvin by the collar of his work jacket, not violently, but with a firmness that made it clear that Calvin was not going anywhere. Calvin did not resist. He had enough experience in difficult docking stations and tense repair jobs to know when the correct move was to be completely still and completely calm. The princess reached them before Varak could say anything. She put one hand lightly on her brother's arm and spoke to him in Drakari, low and quick. Varak responded without looking away from Calvin. His grip did not loosen, but he did not pull Calvin further either. They spoke back and forth for nearly a minute while Calvin stood between them and breathed steadily and tried to look like a man who was not at all frightened. The old healer who had been near the platform pushed through and stood beside the queen. He ran a narrow instrument slowly along her neck and chest. He checked a reading, ran the instrument again, and then stood very still for a moment. He spoke 1 sentence in Drakari. The princess looked at Calvin with an expression that was completely unreadable. Varak finally released his collar. He stepped back, but his blade did not go away. 2 guards came and stood on either side of Calvin, not touching him, but very close. One of the attendants from the engine bay appeared at the connecting passage door, out of breath and wide-eyed, looking between Calvin and the royal family with an expression of pure alarm. Calvin straightened his jacket, picked his handheld screen up off the floor, and said again, calmly, that he was sorry about the wrong door. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke to him directly. The princess turned back to look at her mother, whose color had not faded back to gray yet. Calvin was walked back through the corridor and placed in a small side room near the engine bay. The door was not locked, but 1 guard stood outside it. A few minutes later, a tray of food and water was brought to him, which he appreciated. He sat on a low bench, ate slowly, and tried to work out exactly what had just happened. He had no answer. He was a mechanic. He fixed engines. He did not know anything about Drakari biology or royal customs, or what that faint pulse of color on the queen's scales had meant. He just knew that whatever it was, everything on that ship had changed in the 3 seconds his hand had touched her neck. The small side room they had put Calvin in was not uncomfortable. There was a bench long enough to lie down on, a low table, and a light panel in the ceiling set to a warm amber tone that matched the rest of the ship. Someone had brought him a second tray of food an hour after the first one. He did not recognize most of what was on it, but it smelled fine and tasted something like roasted grain with a faint sweetness underneath. He ate it slowly and sat with his back against the wall and waited. He was good at waiting. 11 years of repair work had taught him that. Sometimes you had to wait for parts. Sometimes you had to wait for a system to cool down before you could open it. Sometimes you just had to sit with a problem and let it settle before the answer became clear. He treated this situation the same way. He did not know what was happening, but he knew that panicking would not help it. The guard outside the door had not moved in 2 hours. Then the door opened and the princess walked in. She was younger than Varak by what Calvin guessed was several years. Her scales were a deeper shade than her brother's, more brown copper than bright copper, and her eyes were the same amber but quicker, moving around the room once before settling on him in a way that felt like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation was about to happen. She carried no weapon. She sat down on the low bench across from him without asking and folded her hands in front of her. A small translation device sat on the table between them. She reached over and turned it on. Her name, she told him, was Lyra. She was the second child of Lady Sarath, and she had spent 6 years studying alien species through the Drakari Academic Archive before her mother's illness had pulled her back to the royal court. She spoke plainly and without the kind of formal stiffness Calvin had seen in Varak. She asked him if he was comfortable and if the food had been acceptable. Calvin said yes to both and asked how the Queen was doing. Lyra looked at him for a moment before answering. She said her mother was stable, more stable than she had been in several weeks. The healers were still monitoring her, but her breathing had not returned to the uneven pattern it had been in before. The color in her scales had not fully returned, but it had not faded back to gray either. It was sitting somewhere in between, which Lyra said was better than anything the healers had achieved with their treatments in the past month. Calvin nodded slowly and said he was glad to hear it, but that he still did not understand what he had done. Lyra said that was exactly what she wanted to talk about. She began asking him questions. She asked about his diet, what he ate regularly, what he drank, how much sleep he got, and at what temperatures he was comfortable. She asked about his work, how many hours he spent with his hands on metal and machinery, whether he worked in hot environments or cold ones. She asked whether he had any known medical conditions, and whether he took any regular supplements or treatments. Calvin answered everything honestly. He said he ate mostly whatever was easy and available, drank a lot of plain water and too much coffee, slept about 6 hours when he was on a job, and more when he was not. He worked in warm engine bays most of the time. He had no medical conditions beyond a bad knee from an old fall, and he took nothing regularly except a standard vitamin supplement that every long-term station worker was advised to use. Lyra listened to every answer carefully. She had a small, flat device in her hand that she wrote notes onto with a thin stylus. She asked follow-up questions about the vitamin supplement, about the specific temperatures in the engine bays he typically worked in, and about how long his hands had been exposed to the heat of the engine work that day before the incident in the royal chamber. Calvin told her he had been working for nearly 7 hours by that point. The engine bay ran warm, around 34 degrees by his suit sensor. His hands had been in direct contact with the compression system and relay nodes for most of that time. Lyra wrote that down and then sat quietly for a moment looking at her notes. Then she stood up and said she needed to speak with the head healer. She turned the translation device off and picked it up from the table. At the door, she stopped and looked back at Calvin and told him, in careful translated words, that he was not in trouble and that her brother's reaction earlier had been fear, not anger, even if it had looked like anger. She asked him to be patient a little longer. Calvin said he was not going anywhere. She left. What happened next, Calvin was not present for, but Lyra told him about it later and he was able to piece it together well enough. She went directly to the healer Orath, who was the oldest and most experienced of the royal physicians, and who had been treating Sarath since the scale fade had first appeared 4 months earlier. Scale fade was rare. It occurred in perhaps 1 in every several thousand Drakari, and it was not fully understood even by their own medical science. What was known was that it involved a slow failure of the internal fire organs, the biological system that regulated heat production inside a Drakari body. Without that internal heat, the body began to shut down from the inside outward, which was why the scales lost their color first. The color came from the warmth beneath them. Every treatment Orath had tried worked on the principle of introducing external heat or chemical stimulation to try to restart the fire organ's natural rhythm. None of it had produced lasting results. The organ would respond briefly and then fall back into its failing pattern, like a fire that caught for a moment and then went out again. Lyra laid out her theory carefully. She told Orath what Calvin had said about his work conditions. 7 hours in a warm engine bay. Hands in direct contact with hot metal and relay systems for most of that time. By the time Calvin had touched the Queen, his hands would have been carrying a significant amount of stored thermal energy. But it was not just the heat that Lyra was focused on. She had read, years ago in the academic archive, a small and largely ignored paper written by a human biologist about something called bioelectric thermal resonance. It was a low-frequency field that human bodies produced naturally, generated by the combination of the human nervous system and the body's own heat regulation. In humans, it was unnoticeable and medically insignificant. The paper had described it mostly as a curiosity, something measured in a lab and then set aside because it had no known practical application. But the paper had also noted one specific property. The frequency of the resonance was unusual. It sat in a range that did not match any known human biological process closely enough to interact with it, which was why it had no effect on humans themselves. It simply existed and was carried in the skin, strongest in the hands and palms. Lyra told Orath what she believed. She believed the resonance had interacted with the outer layer of the Queen's scale tissue in a way that no Drakari treatment could replicate, because no Drakari body produced that frequency. It had not healed the fire organ directly. It had done something more like a gentle nudge, a brief external signal that matched closely enough with the organ's own failing rhythm to give it a moment of stability, like a hand steadying something that was about to fall. Orath listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up his instruments and went back to the Queen's chamber and ran a longer and more detailed scan than he had done before. He was in there for nearly an hour. When he came out, his expression was the careful, neutral expression of someone who had found something surprising and was not yet ready to fully commit to believing it. He told Lyra that her theory was not impossible. For Orath, that was nearly the same as saying she was right. They went together to find Varak. The argument between Varak and Lyra lasted a long time. Calvin could not hear it from the side room, but he could feel the tension of it moving through the ship, the way you can sometimes feel a pressure change before a storm. Something in the air that is not quite sound and not quite feeling, but is definitely there. The guard outside his door had been joined by a second guard at some point, which Calvin noticed but did not comment on. He had spent the time going over the engine repair in his head, working through the steps he still needed to complete, keeping his mind on something useful and concrete. When the door finally opened, it was Lyra again. She had the translation device and she set it on the table and sat down. She looked tired, in the way someone looks when they have been arguing with someone they love and have not quite won, but have not quite lost either. She told Calvin that the royal family had agreed to allow a series of supervised contact sessions. He would be brought to the Queen's chamber once each day. He would sit beside Sarath and place his hand on her neck scales for a measured period of time while Orath monitored her responses. The sessions would be short at first. Everything would be watched closely. If anything went wrong, or if the Queen showed any sign of distress, the sessions would stop immediately. Calvin asked what happened if it worked. Lyra said they would talk about that when they reached it. He asked what happened if it did not work. She was quiet for a moment and then said that they would be no worse off than they already were. Calvin looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said that was fine and that he was willing to help however he could. He also asked if he could continue working on the engine during the days between sessions because leaving a compression system half repaired made him uncomfortable. Lyra looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that meant she had expected him to say something complicated and he had said something simple instead. She said yes, the engine work could continue. The first session was the next morning. Calvin was escorted to the royal chamber by Orath and 2 guards. Varak was already there, standing near the far wall with his arms crossed. He did not look at Calvin when he entered. Lyra stood closer to the platform and gave Calvin a small nod. 2 healers were positioned near Sarath with their instruments ready. Calvin walked to the platform and sat down on a low stool that had been placed beside it. He looked at the Queen properly for the first time. She was still pale, still clearly unwell, but she was awake. Her amber eyes were open, and they moved to find him when he sat down. They watched him with a steadiness that was hard to read. Not hostile, not warm, simply present and observant in the way that very intelligent people sometimes look at something new. Calvin gave her the same small, hand-raised greeting he had given the attendants at the door on his first day. He said good morning, though he was not sure if the translation device carried the pleasantness of it correctly. Sarath did not respond, but her eyes did not look away from him either. Orath spoke, and the translation came through. He told Calvin to place his right hand on the Queen's neck, the same area as before, and to hold it there steadily. Calvin did so. His hand was warm from the engine bay where he had already put in 2 hours of work before being brought here. He rested his palm flat against her scales and kept it still. The room was completely silent for several minutes. Then Orath spoke quietly to Lyra. His instruments were showing a response, small but measurable. The fire organ's rhythm had shifted slightly, steadying in the same way it had during the accidental contact the day before. Lyra relayed this to Calvin in a low voice. Calvin nodded and kept his hand where it was. After 12 minutes, Orath signaled that it was enough for the first session. Calvin lifted his hand and stood up from the stool. He looked at Sarath once more before the guards moved to escort him out. Her eyes were closed now, but the tension that had been in her jaw and neck the day before was softer. It was a small thing, but it was visible if you were looking for it. Varak was still looking at the wall when Calvin left. The sessions continued each day. The second session was 15 minutes. The third was 20. By the fourth session, Orath allowed it to run to 30 minutes, and his instruments showed that the fire organ was not just stabilizing during contact, but holding the improved rhythm for several hours afterward before slowly dipping again. It was not a cure, but it was the clearest and most consistent progress anyone had seen since Sarath's illness began. Calvin treated each session the way he treated every repair job. He showed up on time. He did exactly what was asked of him. He paid attention to the small details. He started bringing a small notebook to jot down observations, things he noticed about the room temperature, about how his hands felt after different amounts of engine work, about whether Sarath's responses seemed stronger on days when he had worked longer before the session. He showed the notebook to Orath without being asked, and Orath studied it with great interest. On the 6th day, Sarath spoke to him directly for the first time. Her voice came through the translation device as low and measured, each word placed carefully. She asked him why he kept coming back. Calvin considered the question. He said that someone needed help and he happened to be there, and he had hands that could provide it. He said it in the same plain way he might explain why he had stopped to help someone fix a broken wheel on a cargo cart in a station corridor. Sarath was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if he wanted anything in return. Calvin said the original payment for the engine job would be fine, and that beyond that he just wanted to know she was going to be all right. The Queen looked at him for a long time after that, not with the neutral, observant expression from the first session, with something different, something that had more weight to it. Across the room, Varak had turned away from the wall. He was watching his mother's face. He had been watching it every session without showing any reaction, but this time something in his own expression had shifted slightly. A small loosening around the jaw, a fraction less rigidity in the set of his shoulders. He did not say anything. He did not need to. By the 10th session, Sarath was sitting upright on the platform without assistance for the first time in months. Her scales at the neck and upper chest had regained nearly full color, the deep copper gold that her attendants later told Lyra had been her natural shade since childhood. She was eating full meals again. She was sleeping without the medicated aids the healers had been using to keep her comfortable. Orath's instruments showed the fire organ running at 60% of its normal capacity and climbing slowly but steadily with each passing day. On the morning of the 12th day, Lyra came to the side room where Calvin was eating breakfast before his engine shift. She sat down and told him that their mother had called for a full court gathering. Nobles had already been contacted, and several were traveling to the station to attend. The gathering would take place in 3 days. Calvin asked what the gathering was for. Lyra said it was for him. Calvin looked at his breakfast and then back at her and said that seemed like a lot of people for one mechanic. Lyra smiled for the first time since he had met her. It was a small smile, quick and genuine, and it changed her face entirely. She said that was precisely the point. The court gathering was not what Calvin had expected. He had pictured something formal and cold, rows of scaled faces watching him stand in the middle of a room while someone read out a verdict of some kind. He had worn his cleanest work jacket, which was still a work jacket, and had managed to get his hair to sit mostly flat, which was the best he could do. Lyra had told him the gathering would be large, and he had prepared himself for large in the way a man prepares for weather he cannot avoid, quietly and without complaint. What he had not prepared for was walking into the royal chamber and finding it completely transformed. The low platform where Sarath had lain for nearly 2 weeks was gone. In its place, the center of the room had been opened up into a wide space, lined on both sides by Drakari nobles standing in formal court robes of deep red and dark gold. There were more than 40 of them. Their scales caught the amber light from the ceiling and threw it back in small, warm flashes. At the far end of the room, on a raised step of pale gray stone, stood Lady Sarath. She was standing completely on her own. Her scales were the full, deep copper gold that Calvin had only seen glimpses of during the later sessions. Her posture was straight and unhurried. She wore court robes that were darker than the others in the room, almost black, with fine gold thread running through them in the same wing patterns that were carved into the chamber walls. She looked like exactly what she was, a queen who had come back from somewhere very far away and had returned without losing a single piece of herself in the process. Calvin stopped just inside the door. Orath appeared at his elbow and spoke quietly through a small personal translator. He told Calvin to walk to the center of the room and stand still, and that everything would be explained. Calvin nodded and walked forward. The nobles on both sides watched him move. Nobody spoke. The room was so quiet that Calvin could hear the faint hum of the station beyond the ship's hull. He stopped in the center and stood still as instructed. Sarath looked at him from the raised step, and then she began to speak. Her voice carried easily across the room, low and full and steady. Orath translated in a murmur close to Calvin's ear, keeping pace with her words. She told her court that 3 weeks ago, a human had come aboard their ship to repair a broken engine. She said he had come with no agenda beyond his work and no knowledge of what was happening inside the forward chambers. She said that what followed had not been planned or predicted by anyone, not by her healers, not by her children, and certainly not by the human himself. She said that was perhaps the most important part of the story. She paused and looked across the assembled nobles slowly before continuing. She told them that for 4 months her court had tried to solve her illness using every resource they possessed. They had used knowledge and medicine and technology and the combined effort of the finest Drakari healers alive. None of it had been enough. And then a man with grease on his hands had taken a wrong turn and stumbled through a door, and in 3 seconds of accidental contact had done what months of deliberate effort had not. She said she had thought about this a great deal during her recovery. She said she did not believe it was a miracle. She believed it was something more interesting than a miracle. It was a reminder that the universe was larger than any single species' understanding of it, and that closing doors against the outside world was not protection, it was blindness. She said that the boundary the Drakari royal court had drawn around itself, around its ship, around its people, had nearly cost her life. Not because their enemies had crossed it, because they themselves had made it so tight that the one thing capable of helping her had almost never reached her at all. The room was absolutely still. Calvin was listening to the translation with his eyes forward and his hands at his sides, and his expression very calm, which was the expression he used when he was actually quite moved by something, but did not know what to do with it. Sarath stepped down from the raised stone and walked across the room toward him. The nobles on both sides straightened slightly as she passed. She stopped in front of Calvin and looked at him directly. She was taller than him by nearly a full head, and her amber eyes held the particular steadiness of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and was now simply carrying it out. She spoke, and Orath translated. She said that the Drakari royal line did not believe in debt between individuals. She said debt implied that one party had taken something from another and owed its return. That was not what had happened here. What had happened here was a gift, freely given and freely received, and gifts were answered not with repayment, but with recognition. She reached into the fold of her court robe and brought out a small, flat piece of dark stone, smooth and oval, with a single gold line running through its center in the shape of a wing. She held it out to Calvin. Orath told him it was the mark of an honored guest of the Drakari throne. It had been given to fewer than 10 non-Drakari in the entire recorded history of the royal line. It granted the holder safe passage through any Drakari territory, access to Drakari ports and stations, and the right to call on the royal house for assistance once, without condition or question. Calvin looked at the stone in her hand and then up at her face. He reached out and took it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. He said very quietly that he was not sure he had done enough to deserve something like that. Sarath answered, and Orath translated. She said that was exactly why he deserved it. A sound moved through the assembled nobles then, low and resonant, a kind of collective exhale that Calvin later learned was the Drakari formal expression of agreement, the sound a court made when it endorsed its queen's words without reservation. Even Varak made the sound. Calvin heard it from the right side of the room and glanced over. Varak was standing with the nobles, his arms no longer crossed, his expression no longer set in the rigid, careful blankness it had carried for 2 weeks. He met Calvin's eyes briefly and gave him one short nod. It was not warm exactly, but it was real, and from Varak that felt like a great deal. Lyra was standing near the back of the room. When Calvin looked her way, she gave him the same small, quick smile from 3 days ago. He gave her a small nod back. After the gathering, the nobles dispersed gradually into quieter conversations, and Calvin found himself standing near the chamber wall with the flat stone in his hand, not quite sure what to do next. Lyra came over and stood beside him. She told him that she and Orath had drafted a joint research proposal that would be sent to both Drakari medical institutions and human biological science boards. It would outline the bioelectric resonance theory and the documented results of the contact sessions and request formal collaborative study between the two species. She said it would take time and that many people on both sides would be skeptical. She said that was fine because the data was solid, and solid data had a way of outlasting skepticism if you were patient enough. Calvin said she was welcome to use everything he had contributed, and that if the researchers needed him to come back at some point for further study, he would be available as long as the pay was reasonable. Lyra laughed. It was a fuller laugh than the smile had suggested she was capable of, and it surprised him. She said she would make sure the terms were fair. He went back to the engine bay that afternoon and finished the compression repair. It took 4 more hours of steady, careful work. When he ran the final diagnostic, the system came up clean across every channel. He packed his kit bag, checked the bay once more out of habit, and signed off on the job completion form. The attendant who had watched him work on the first day escorted him back to the loading bridge. At the door, the attendant paused and said something without the translation device. Calvin did not understand the words, but the attendant pressed one hand briefly to its own chest and then extended it slightly toward him, a gesture that felt like it meant something specific and personal. Calvin pressed his own hand to his chest and extended it back. The attendant nodded and stepped aside. Calvin walked across the loading bridge with his kit bag over his shoulder and the dark stone in his jacket pocket. Behind him, the Drakari royal vessel sat in its docking clamp, its hull catching the low light of the station, its engines running clean and steady and ready to carry a queen home. He did not look back. He was already thinking about the next job. But his hand, the one that had reached out in a moment of clumsy, off-balance stumbling and touched the neck of a dying queen, felt different to him now in a way he could not fully explain. Not heavier, not changed in any way he could point to or measure, just a little more aware of what it was capable of. End of story.